I like to start off every discussion of serial murder with a quote from Fox and Levin that I think sums some of it up nicely. And that is, there may be more scholars studying serial murder than there are offenders committing it. Because there are so many people interested in this topic. And I mean, the general public as well, but also us academic scholars. But there are not that many serial murderers. And this is because most murderers, sexual or otherwise, are not serial murderers. Most people who commit a homicide commit one. Most of them do. Or one or two, but definitely not meeting the threshold of three. Serial murderers, though, account for a large proportion of homicide crime incidents. So a lot of the murders that happen are committed by a serial offender, but most homicide offenders are not serial. So this is why it's such an interesting topic, because they while they're small in number in terms of the people, they commit a large proportion of the murders that happen. So they're interesting. We like to try to explain them, but it's also because they make up a lot of the proportion of people who get killed are killed by serial murderers. So, while most people who are committing homicide are not serial murderers, most are, at least a large proportion of murders are committed by serial murderers. So that's why they're just this really interesting topic for a lot of people. So serial murder then, it's 3 or more victims and 3 or more separate events. It's kind of been the agreed upon definition. But that kind of can change, and there's been some where it's like, well, if it's 2, but there were some attempts of other victims, then should that be considered serial murder? So it's not cut and dry necessarily, but that's kind of the most agreed upon definition. And so those 3 or more separate events means that there are these cooling off periods in between each murder. And so the modus operandi of serial murderers, there are different ways that people can commit these crimes. So the wander or travel type offender, this is where some serial killers wander great geographical distances, killing along the way. Ted Bundy, very good example of this. He traveled all across the U.S. In the 1970s, killing all along the way. So that's one MO. Another MO is the lure, and this is where serial murderers, they stay in one location and then they lure victims to them. John Wayne Gacy, very good example of that. He killed 30 or more, at least 30 boys within the Chicago area, and they were literally almost all the bodies were found underneath, like in his backyard underneath his house, and so definitely a lure type. Then there are the justify or sort of God complex serial murderers. These ones are, the killers think that they are helping their victims, often by ending suffering of some kind. Britain's most notorious serial killer, Frederick Shipman, he was a general practitioner. He killed more than 218 elderly patients. That's like the highest estimate, but I'm sure it's more than that. I've looked into his case, and it's probably more than that. Those are just the ones that he's admitted to and that he kept count, and that there's evidence of. So, but that was because they're helping end their suffering, even if they're just old and there's nothing actually wrong with them. So definitely a God complex there. Sadism is another MO. This is people who gain pleasure and satisfaction, sexual satisfaction from killing. Dennis Rader, he was the BTK strangler, which is bind, torture, kill. He was a sadist for sure. He carefully planned his murders. He stalked the victims. He masturbated over their bodies. He enjoyed the media attention. He actually gave himself the name, the BTK. So sadism is definitely part of it for a lot of serial murderers, especially if there's a sexual component. Psychopathy is another. This is sort of where the motivation is the idea that these people have an inability to feel empathy or remorse. They literally just cannot think or feel how other people would think or feel, and they can't understand that other people are other people. And it's a very weird thing to lack empathy. But they're basically just concerned with their own needs. They don't care about other people. And definitely, I mean, all of the examples I've given, Bundy, Gacy, Rader, Shipman, they all would be considered psychopaths. Female serial killers, definitely a minority within serial killers, just like they're a minority within murderers in general. But there's a higher proportion in the serial killers than amongst one-time single murderers. So that's interesting. But there are about 10 to 15% of serial killers. Eileen Wuornos, probably the most, definitely one of, if not the most notorious female serial killer. She was a prostitute turned serial killer. She killed a bunch of her Johns. She was definitely out of touch with reality. She thought that either the police or some higher power was telling her to do this, and they wanted the bad guys off the street, and she was doing their work. And so interesting case. But in general, female serial killers, they're much more likely to poison or smother their victims, whereas males are more likely to beat, bludgeon, strangle, and serial killers in general. We like to think that they're just they're crazy, they're out of touch with reality, like Eileen Wuornos definitely was. But they're actually typically, and this is another good quote from Fox and Levin, they're more cruel than crazy. This means that typically serial killers don't suffer delusions or hallucinations. They don't have that break from reality. They're just psychopathic and or sadistic. So it's cruelty, not craziness, that sort of underlies the motivations for most of these serial murderers. The FBI Behavioral Sciences Unit, they use profiling to help identify potential suspects when they're looking for serial killers. And so they use things like signatures, modus operandi, crime scene information, witness statements, all to come up with profiles of serial murderers. Because when you're trying to hunt somebody, you need you're trying to hunt somebody down when they're a serial murderer and you're trying to stop them. You need as much information as you can. And these profiles help to sort of narrow down the search in terms of where do you begin, and so what should this person look like, what should their life look like, what should they be doing, what do they spend their time doing, what do they look like, what do they drive. So there's a lot of information that they can get from profiles that are not necessarily 100% accurate, but it gives them a good starting point when they're trying to find these people, when they're in the midst of their killings. So then mass murder is different from serial murder because, again, this is not necessarily a strict definition, but this is the most agreed upon definition, where it's 4 or more victims within a single event. So you don't have that cooling off period between victims, and that's kind of what differentiates them. It's one single event. And it's specifically by one or a few offenders, because this does not include highly organized or institutionalized killings. So things like war crimes or large-scale terrorism, those are completely different motivations. And so that is not what is included in your definition of mass murder. So there are different types of mass murder, and it's kind of based on their motivation, essentially. So revenge killers, these people want to get even with either a specific person or specific people or society as a whole. And so the picture there, Cho, he was the one who killed 32 people and injured 17 in the Virginia Tech shooting in April of 2007. Revenge killer. He had his manifesto that went out, and it was about how everybody treats him badly and the world is crap and whatever else he said. I don't really know. I don't really care what his manifesto said. But the idea was that he wanted to get revenge, and that was what he was doing. And he just basically had a beef against society in general, but also his school, and that was why he decided to shoot it up. And that's what revenge killers, when we're talking about mass murderers, there's some kind of wrong or injustice they feel has been done to them. Then love killers, these are people who have the very warped sense of devotion. Typically they commit suicide and take others with them, and usually it's family members. This is actually where you're going to see more females. I mean, they don't outnumber the men, but you're going to see if there's a female mass murderer, typically it's her killing her. She's killing her children and herself, so she's killing her family. But there's still more men that are mass murderers. But the love killers it's typically like the family annihilator situation. But it's this idea that I'm saving them from this terrible world, and it's better that they're dead and that we all go together than to live in this terrible world. Then profit killers. These killers are typically covering up a crime, or they're eliminating witnesses, or they're carrying out some kind of criminal conspiracy. So like killing a lot of people when really there was only one target, and that's to cover up any relationship that they have with the individual target, or throwing off police by killing other people. So if they only killed their single target, then it would be much easier to connect it back to them. So they're profit killers, because these are often people that are like carrying out hits and things like that. Not necessarily, but the idea is they're getting something out of it. There's some kind of they're getting something, whether for themselves or for somebody else. And then you have your terrorist killers, which these would be people trying to send a message. It might be like warning rival gang members or warning society about an impending doom. But the idea is that they're trying to instill fear, and their message is one of fear, that, be afraid of me, or be afraid of some big thing that's coming to society, or whatever. That's going to hurt everybody or kill everybody. And so that kind of, sometimes it can tie in with that whole love idea of that warped sense of trying to save people. But often it's just, I want people to be afraid. So then spree killers are not mass murders. They're kind of separate from, they're not serial killers, they're not mass murders, they're kind of fall somewhere in between. And so spree killers would be where you have a rampage of violence taking place over days or weeks. So it's not confined to a single incident like mass murders are. So a mass murder is one incident. It could be a lengthy incident, but it's continual violence going on throughout the incident. Whereas spree killers are, it's not one incident. It's multiple different incidents, maybe different locations, but you don't have the same cooling off period like you have with serial killers. So it's like a constant rampage where they're not backing down, they're not stopping, but it's different incidents. And that would be what a spree killer is. And so best example of this would be the DC snipers. And that was Lee Boyd Malvo and John Muhammad. They killed 10 and injured 3 over a 3-week period. This was in 2002. They were in Maryland, Virginia, ended in Washington, D.C., which is why they were the DC snipers. And crazy story with them. I invite you to go look into them because they have a crazy backstory. Malvo was just a kid. Muhammad was an adult who was the ringleader, but he kind of made Malvo do all the shootings. But definitely look into them if you don't know much about them. But so that's kind of the difference between when we look at serial murder versus mass murder versus spree murder. And so those are kind of, it's all about whether it's a single incident or multiple incidents, and then how far apart those incidents are. Is it enough that there's a cooling off period or not? And that's kind of the differentiating features.